We know that despots arise in every government, global or otherwise. And can you imagine what the world would be like today if there had already been a global government in existence when Adolf Hitler came to power, and there were no other nations on the earth able to align against him to stop his plans for whatever he was going to do? We know that politics is always going to attract the very sort of people who should never be allowed to have that kind of power. And yet, somehow they always contrive to grab that power to themselves. They're sociopathic personalities. They're perfectly willing to see millions of people die for whatever their agenda happens to be. Nero burned down half of Rome because he wanted to rebuild it with a grand palace for himself, about where the Vatican is right now, and he dumped the blame on the Christians. So if you have a global government, a one-world government, what happens when a Nero or a Hitler or a George Bush ascends to power? Starts talking about those useless eaters and what are we going to do with them? Or a Henry Kissinger who was out there saying we have to kill off the people in those undeveloped areas before they use up our natural resources. That kind of thinking comes with a global government around it. There's no stopping it. The other situation is, as we've seen here in the United States of America, with this desperate desire to pull us back to the height of the Cold War, any one government is only going to preserve itself in its status quo. It's not looking to advance. It's not looking to improve or make changes. It fossilizes eventually. And if you have a global government, that's basically going to end the evolution of future civilizations. We need multiple countries and a continuing experimentation with better ways to organize our society. And the biggest problem I have with global government that's brought into being with lies and deceptions like global warming, it has to be a dictatorship. It can't allow freedom of speech and inquiry just to survive the circumstances of its own creation. So the new global government, the new world order, will be a tyranny. We'll be right back. Alrighty, let's see. Now, as you're aware, our nation has mutated into something truly horrible. And we know that to be the fact. I know there's a lot of Americans still trying to pretend it's not so, or to pretend it's perfectly okay for our country to be doing what we're doing. Just, please don't have the Gestapo come kick down my door or anything like that. But the reality is that our nation is engaging in exactly the same kind of behavior as the Third Reich. Most notably, the use of torture. And as you know, there was the problem of all these so-called CIA black sites where they were maintaining these torture centers in other countries so they wouldn't be discovered, and they got discovered anyway. And there was this case of this one guy who was tortured, Abu Zubaydah. Sorry, I mispronounced his name here. Basically, there were videotapes made of the torture sessions. I guess they're made of all the torture sessions, and then they send them to the White House, and then the Security Council sits around late at night abusing themselves watching these guys being tortured. But in 2005, tapes that were being requested by a congressional investigation were destroyed. The CIA simply destroyed them, said, we burned them all up, tough, what are you going to do about it? And apparently, a guy named Jose Rodriguez has written a new book defending torture, saying it's a proud moment in American history to torture these guys into confessions. And apparently, these videotapes of this guy being tortured showed him, stripped naked, being waterboarded, vomiting and screaming. And that's why the CIA didn't want the tapes to be made public. But it doesn't matter if the tapes are made public or not. We know this is what the government is doing. We know because of the scars on the body of Binyam Mohammed that far worse things than waterboarding are being done to these people to secure these politically useful confessions. And when people defending the government come around and say, well, torture is necessary to get at the truth, just ask them, do you believe in witches? Do you think there are women wearing pointy hats and riding broomsticks across the sky, inconveniencing civil aviation, casting spells, turning people into frogs? Do you actually think that's out there? Because under torture, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of women confessed to doing exactly that and were executed for the crime. Technically, they were executed for heresy, which means freedom of choice. You cannot say that torture produces accurate information unless you're willing to say that you believe in witches riding brooms across the sky. Because every one of those convictions by the witch courts was sound in logic and law, founded on confessions extracted under torture. Like I said, we seem to have a government leadership intent on taking us back to just before the Magna Carta was signed, because even the Magna Carta says confessions extracted under torture are worthless. This is not a proud moment in the history of the United States of America. This is our blackest hour, and one that every American citizen ought to cringe in shame in comprehending, and certainly not one that we should ever give our moral or financial support to perpetuating.
And they're saying their biggest threat now is ultraviolet radiation from the sun can be used.
I'm a photographer,
Whoops,
and when I was living in...
There we are. I hit a button accidentally on this page. I apologize for that. So I want to talk about ultraviolet light from the sun can be used to defeat the stealth process. So they're putting out requests for bid about a UV obscurant device that will be on the plane and spray stuff around and, whatever. I don't know. Why don't you just rub copper tone tanning oil onto the plane, and that'll block the ultraviolet light there. Do I get the contract? Do I get this military it is amazing sometimes that the solutions to these problems are actually very simple and inexpensive, and the government will go for this completely overblown, hideously expensive, complicated system. And then it won't work, and people are wondering why it won't work. And it just sits there, and the problem just gets worse and worse and worse. We've been talking, of course, about the F22 that is asphyxiating its pilots. And it turns out there's a new problem. Apparently, there, along with the problems delivering oxygen to the pilots, there is something within the system that is delivering an irritant of some kind to the pilots. They're calling it raptor cough. After they fly a mission in this aircraft, if it hasn't asphyxiated them and, killed their brains for lack of oxygen, their lungs are irritated and they're coughing. 4 years, the world's most expensive fighter plane, and it's still killing the pilots. But by golly, we're going to go out and spend more money for an ultraviolet obscurant for the planes. Like I said, tanning oil. Just put tanning oil on the plane. You'll be fine.